The ride had started like 100 others, engines humming low and steady as the bikers moved through the long stretch of forest road that cut through miles of untouched land, tall trees, rising on both sides like silent witnesses, their branches forming a canopy that swallowed sunlight and sound alike, turning the afternoon into something dimmer and heavier than it should have been. And none of the riders expected anything more than the simple peace that came from motion, from the rhythm of wheels on asphalt, and the quiet understanding shared between people who didn't need to talk to feel connected. The road was rarely used, a forgotten artery winding deep into the woods where phone signals died and time seemed to slow, and that was exactly why they liked it. Because out here, the world felt honest, stripped down to earth and breath and sound. The lead biker eased off the throttle as the group entered a particularly dense section, the forest pressing closer, the air cooler, and for a moment there was nothing but the layered growl of engines and the distant cry of birds startled by their passing, until something else slipped into the soundscape, so faint it almost didn't register, a thin break in the natural order that made one rider glance sideways without knowing why. A few seconds passed, engines rolling on, tires humming, and then it came again, clearer this time, a sound that didn't belong to wind or animal or echo, a short, sharp cry that cut through the forest like a blade, high-pitched and trembling, carrying fear in its tone. The lead biker raised a fist instinctively, the universal signal, and the group slowed together, engines dropping into a low rumble as they coasted to a stop along the shoulder where moss crept close to the pavement, helmets turning as each rider listened, hearts thudding louder now than their machines. At first, doubt crept in, the mind trying to make sense of what the ears had caught. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was the forest playing tricks, but then the sound came again, unmistakable now, a child's voice, cracking with terror, calling out from somewhere deep beyond the trees, and in that instant, the air changed, the easy calm of the ride dissolving into something tight and urgent. One biker pulled off his helmet, eyes wide, listening harder, and said quietly, "That's a kid." His voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might make the sound disappear, and another shook his head slowly, disbelief etched across his face. Because no child should have been out here, not for miles in any direction, not in a place where even adults rarely ventured. The cry echoed again, longer this time, breaking into sobs that seemed to snag on branches and leaves as they traveled, and every rider felt it settle in their chest like a weight, the sound of fear too raw to ignore, too human to dismiss. Engines clicked as they shut off one by one, silence rushing in so fast it rang, and in that silence, the woods seemed to lean closer, holding its breath, and the voice came again, clearer now that the machines were quiet, a black child's voice, hoarse and shaking, calling for help in words that cracked apart as soon as they formed. No one spoke for a long moment, the reality of it pressing down on them. Because this wasn't a breakdown or an accident or a problem that could be fixed with tools and time. This was something else entirely. Something that demanded a choice. And finally, one of the older riders broke the silence, his voice low and steady as he said, "We can't ride away from that." And no one argued, because every single one of them already knew that whatever lay beyond the trees, whatever waited in the shadows of that forest, the ride had ended the moment they heard that cry. And something far older and far darker than any of them realized was about to be dragged out of the woods into the light. The man who had spoken first was named Reggie, a broad-shouldered rider in his late 40s, whose beard was flecked with gray and whose calm never felt cold, only seasoned, the kind of calm you earned by living through storms you didn't advertise. And when he said, "We can't ride," away from that, it landed like a rule nobody needed to vote on, because even the ones who like to act tough knew there are some sounds that strip you down to what you really are. And a child crying in the woods was one of them. The group had 8 riders that day, not a gang out looking for trouble, not a parade, just friends and brothers and one woman rider named Tasha, who kept pace with the best of them, her eyes sharp and steady behind her visor. And as engines cooled and the forest quieted, they stood along the shoulder in a rough semicircle, listening again, trying to locate the direction, because the woods played tricks with sound, bouncing it off trunks and rock and distance until it felt like the cry could be everywhere and nowhere at once. Another wail rose, higher this time, and it wasn't just fear in it now. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes when you've been calling for help too long without being answered. And every rider felt their chest tighten at the thought of how long that voice might have been out there, how many minutes, hours, or days a child could spend in a place like this before the world forgot them. Tasha lifted a hand, palm out, not to stop the group now, but to quiet the impulse that wanted to rush blindly into the trees, because urgency without thought could get them killed out there. And she said, "We go in smart, not loud," her voice firm, eyes scanning the undergrowth as if it might suddenly move on its own. Reggie nodded. "Phones got signal?" he asked, and 3 of them checked, holding their devices up like fragile hope, only to see the same empty bars they already knew would be there. The road had swallowed technology the moment they entered this stretch, and the silence around them felt more deliberate because of it, like the forest was daring them to rely on nothing but themselves. "No signal," one of the younger riders, Malik, said, frustration sharpening his tone. Malik was 27, the newest in their circle, big heart, quick hands, the kind of man who got angry at injustice faster than he got afraid of danger. And right now his jaw was clenched, eyes narrowed, because he couldn't stand the idea of a child out there needing help while they stood talking. Reggie put a hand on his shoulder. "We hear him first," Reggie said, "then we move." They all went still, as if the woods could be listened to like a radio station if you turned the dial. Slowly enough, and for a moment there was nothing, just the faint drip of water from leaves, the far-off tapping of a woodpecker, the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. Then the cry came again, closer to the right side of the road, beyond a dip where the trees thickened and the ground fell away slightly. It was a voice, yes, but it carried something else too, a strange rhythm under it that made Tasha's eyes narrow. "That's not just crying," she murmured. "It's like he's calling out in patterns." "Or he's repeating something," Reggie replied, and the thought made the air feel colder. Another rider, Big Leon, a tall man with shoulders like a truck and a gentle demeanor that surprised people, stepped forward to the tree line and called out, loud enough too. Carrie, but not so loud it felt like a threat. "Hey, you out there? We hear you. Keep talking." The forest swallowed his voice. For a second, there was only silence, and then the child's voice returned, strained and thin, and this time words formed clearly enough to punch through the trees. "Don't leave me, please, don't leave me." Malik swore under his breath, eyes wet with fury. "Who leaves a kid out here?" Tasha glanced at him sharply. "Focus," she said. "We don't know what this is." Reggie did a quick head count, then pointed to the bikes. "Keys in pockets," he instructed. "Bags on. If we have to carry, we carry. If we have to run, we run." They grabbed what they could. Water bottles, a small first aid kit, flashlights, even though it was daytime, because the woods could make day feel like dusk, if you went deep enough. Malik had a hoodie tied around his waist. He yanked it off and folded it under his arm like he already knew the child would be shaking. Reggie took the lead, not because he needed to be the hero, but because he had the kind of steadiness that could keep panic from turning into stupidity. Tasha walked second, scanning, eyes moving like she was reading invisible warning signs in the branches. Big Leon stayed near the back, the silent wall, the one you wanted behind you when the unknown tried to show its teeth. They stepped off the asphalt into the forest, boots sinking into damp earth, and immediately the world changed. Sound muffled, air thick, the smell of wet soil and decay wrapping around them. The trees were tall and packed close, their trunks dark, bark slick, and undergrowth tangled in vines that grabbed at ankles like hands that didn't want them to pass. "Keep calling," Reggie said, turning his head slightly as he moved. "Kid, we're coming. Keep talking." The voice came again, weaker now, but it responded. And that response alone told them the child was not imagining things, not a ghost in the woods, not a distant echo. Because fear doesn't answer you back in words unless someone real is carrying it. I'm here, the child said. And then something else followed. Something that made Reggie stop so abruptly that the others nearly bumped into him. The child whispered, barely audible, like he was afraid even the trees might be listening. He said, "Don't tell." Malik blinked hard. "Who said?" He demanded, but he wasn't shouting at the child. He was shouting at the invisible figure his mind had already started to build. Reggie raised a hand, signaling patience. "Son," he called, voice gentle now. "What's your name?" The child hesitated, and in that hesitation, the forest seemed to press closer. When the voice finally came, it sounded like it had been dragged from somewhere deep and guarded. "Micah," the child said. "My name is Micah." Tasha sucked in a breath, because a child who can say his name can usually say where his parents are, can usually say what happened, but Micah had already said something more alarming than being lost. He said, "Don't tell." And that single phrase turned the rescue into something else, something with a shadow behind it. Reggie kept moving, slower now, careful, eyes scanning the ground for signs, footprints, broken branches, anything that suggested the child had been brought here, not wandered. The ground was soft enough to hold impressions, and Tasha crouched once, running her fingers along a small depression. "Barefoot," she murmured. "Small. Recent." Her gaze lifted. "He's close." They pushed deeper, and the cries began to shift from distant to immediate, like the woods were thinning between them and the source. Malik called out again, "Micah, we're right here." "Can you see us?" The voice responded, and for a moment it sounded like the child was trying to control his breathing. "No," Micah said, I'm in the dark." Reggie's mouth went dry. "Dark?" he repeated. "Like under trees." "No," Micah whispered, like a hole. The word hit them all at once, each rider's mind flashing through possibilities they didn't want to name, because a hole in the woods could mean a lot of things. An old well, a collapsed ditch, an animal trap, something left behind by people who didn't care who fell into it. "Micah," Reggie said, voice low, steady. "Are you hurt?" A pause, a shaky breath. "My leg hurts," Micah said, "and I'm cold." Malik's eyes burned. "We're getting you out," he said, more promise than sentence. They moved faster now, but careful, because rushing could mean someone else fell into whatever hole Micah was trapped in. The trees began to thin slightly, and the ground dipped into a natural hollow where the earth looked disturbed, not by animals, but by something older and more intentional. Reggie slowed, scanning, and then Big Leon pointed to a cluster of brush that looked wrong, too neatly piled, too deliberately arranged. "There," he said, "that's covering something." They approached cautiously, pulling vines aside, and the smell changed, dampness turning sharper, like stagnant air trapped under soil. Malik pushed through the brush, and suddenly the ground dropped away into a rough opening hidden beneath branches and leaves, a black mouth in the earth. The child's voice came from inside it, closed now, trembling. "Don't leave," Micah whimpered. "Please don't leave." Reggie dropped to his knees at the edge, careful not to dislodge the cover and collapse anything further, and he spoke into the darkness the way you speak to someone you're trying to keep alive. "We're here, Micah," he said. "I'm right above you. You hear me?" "Yes," Micah whispered, and then the voice cracked. And it wasn't just fear now, it was relief, so intense it hurt. I thought you weren't real." Tasha shined her flashlight down, and the beam cut into the darkness, revealing damp walls of earth and old wood supports, like a forgotten cellar or crawl space, the kind of thing that might have belonged to a house that no longer existed. And there, huddled near one side, was a small figure, knees pulled to chest, hair matted, eyes reflecting the light like startled animal eyes. The boy looked younger than his voice suggested, maybe 7 or 8, thin as if meals were rare, his shirt too big, stained, and his face carried the kind of dirt that didn't come from playing outside, but from being outside too long without care. Malik's breath hitched. Big Leon swore softly, not in anger but in grief. Micah looked up at the light, squinting, and when he saw the silhouettes of people above him, his mouth opened like he wanted to speak, but only a shaky sob came out. Reggie's voice softened. "Micah, listen to me," he said. "We're going to get you out, but I need you to tell me, are you alone down there?" Micah's eyes darted to the side, deeper into the darkness, and for half a second he didn't answer, and in that hesitation the forest around them felt suddenly too quiet, too aware. Then Micah whispered, barely audible, the words making every rider's spine tighten, "I'm not supposed to talk about the other door." Reggie didn't respond right away, not because he hadn't heard Micah, but because the weight of those words needed space to land, and in that space every rider felt the forest close in tighter, the shadows thickening around the opening like they were guarding whatever secret had been buried here long before any of them arrived. "The other door," Reggie repeated carefully, keeping his voice level, non-threatening, because fear could shut a child down faster than darkness ever could, and Micah shrank back slightly, nodding once, his eyes flicking again toward the unseen corner of the underground space, as if something there might hear him. Tasha crouched beside Reggie, shining her light deeper, careful not to blind the boy, and what the beam revealed made her stomach drop, because the walls weren't just dirt and roots, they were reinforced with rotting planks, old nails rusted into the wood, evidence that this place hadn't been formed by nature alone, but by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. "This isn't an animal hole," she murmured. "This was built." Malik clenched his fists so hard his knuckles went white, the urge to jump down and pull Micah out, battling with the knowledge that reckless movement could collapse the space or hurt the child more, and he forced himself to breathe, because right now, calm was more important than strength. "Micah," he said gently, lowering himself closer to the opening so his voice would carry clearly, "how long have you been down there?" The boy hesitated again, his small fingers twisting in the fabric of his oversized shirt, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded unsure of its own meaning. "I don't know," Micah whispered. "It's been a lot of nights." The phrase sent a chill through the group. Because children counted time in school days and holidays, not in nights, unless days had blurred together so completely that only darkness remained as a marker. At the others, reading the same realization in their eyes, that whatever had happened here was not recent, not an accident, not something that could be explained away easily. And he turned back to Micah, choosing his words with care. "Do you know how you got here?" he asked. Micah shook his head slowly. "I remember trees," he said, "and someone carrying me. And he said it was a game. He said I had to stay quiet." Malik let out a sharp breath through his nose, anger flashing across his face like fire. But Tasha shot him a look that said, "Not now, because." Rage would not help the boy remember safely, and she leaned closer to the opening, lowering her flashlight so the beam rested on the ground near Micah's feet instead of his face. "Your leg hurts," she said softly. "Which one?" Micah pointed shakily to his left leg, and as the light followed his gesture, they saw swelling around the ankle, the skin angry and red, dirt caked over. A wound that looked like it had reopened more than once, and Big Leon swallowed hard, because he had daughters, and he knew what a child looked like when pain had been endured too long without comfort. "We need to get him out now," Malik said, unable to hold it back anymore, his voice tight. Reggie nodded. "We will," he said, "but we do it right." He shifted his weight and peered into the hole, assessing angles, distance, the stability of the opening, because if this space collapsed with Micah inside, no amount of good intentions would matter. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through, and the drop looked deeper than it should have been for a simple cellar. The darkness below swallowing the beam of the flashlight too quickly. "I can't fit," Malik said immediately, already unzipping his jacket. "I'm lighter." Reggie considered him for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "First we talk." He turned back to Micah, keeping his tone warm. "Micah, you did the right thing calling out," he said. "You're not in trouble. Nobody's mad at you. But I need you to tell me about that other door. Where is it?" Micah's breathing sped up, his chest rising and falling too fast, and Tasha noticed immediately, holding up a hand to Reggie, signaling him to slow down, because panic could send the boy into shock. She spoke instead, her voice softer, steadier. "Hey," she said, "look at me. You're safe right now. We're here." Micah's eyes flicked upward, locking onto her face, and she gave him a small smile, the kind you give a scared child when you want them to know you see them. "The other door," she continued gently. "Is it near you?" Micah nodded. "Behind the boards," he whispered. "He said not to open it. He said bad things happen if I open it." The riders exchanged looks, dread creeping in, because behind boards could mean a passage, a tunnel, something connecting this hole to somewhere else, and the idea of what might be on the other side twisted in their guts. "Did anyone come through that door?" Reggie asked quietly. Micah shook his head. Not since I was little," he said. And then, as if realizing what he had said, he froze, his eyes widening in confusion. Malik's heart slammed against his ribs. "What do you mean, little?" he asked before Reggie could stop him, and Micah's lip trembled. "I don't remember before," Micah whispered. "He said my old name doesn't matter anymore." Silence fell like a curtain, thick and suffocating, because a child who didn't remember a time before captivity was not dealing with days or weeks, but something far worse. And Reggie felt the truth settle into his bones with a cold certainty that this was not just a rescue. It was the uncovering of something buried deliberately, something old. "Micah," Reggie said softly, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the alarm screaming in his head. "How old are you?" Micah frowned, thinking hard, then shrugged helplessly. I think "I think I'm 8, he said, and then added, almost apologetically, "But I don't know for sure." Tasha closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, her gaze sharpening with resolve. "We're calling. This in the moment, we have signal," she said quietly to the others. "This is bigger than us." Reggie nodded. "But first, we get him out." He leaned forward again, speaking into the darkness, with a firmness that carried safety. "Micah, I'm going to come down to you," he said. "I'm going to help you up. Is that okay?" Micah hesitated, fear flickering across his face, and then he nodded, gripping his knees tighter. "Okay," he whispered. Malik moved immediately, clearing branches away from the opening, widening it just enough, while Big Leon secured a rope from his pack, knotting it with hands that had tied lines under pressure before, and Tasha kept her light trained on Micah, talking to him softly about nothing important, about the sound of birds, about how the sun felt when you stood in it too long, anchoring him to the present while the men prepared. Reggie eased himself into the opening, careful with each movement, the smell of damp earth and old wood growing stronger as he descended, and as his boots touched the floor of the hole, the beam of light revealed more of the space, shelves carved into the dirt walls, remnants of old cans rusted beyond recognition, scraps of fabric folded neatly in one corner like someone had tried to make a home underground. Reggie's chest tightened, because this place had not just held a child, it had held time, years of it, hidden from the world. And as he knelt in front of Micah, meeting the boy's eyes at the same level, he understood that whatever lay behind that other door, whatever secret had been sealed away for 2 decades, was about to be dragged into the open, because the woods had finally decided to speak. Reggie lowered himself fully into the cramped space, careful not to jostle the fragile wooden supports, and as his boots settled into the damp earth, he felt the weight of the place press against his chest, the kind of weight that came not from physical confinement, but from the sense that this hole had been holding on to pain for a very long time. And when he crouched in front of Micah, he made himself small, lowering his shoulders, softening his posture, so the boy would not feel cornered by another adult standing over him. "You did real good," Reggie said quietly, his voice steady and warm. "You called out. That takes courage." Micah stared at him with wide, searching eyes, as if trying to decide whether courage was something he was allowed to have. And then he nodded faintly, his body still curled tight, as if releasing himself from that shape might invite danger. Above them, Malik and Big Leon worked silently, widening the opening just enough to allow for a careful lift, while Tasha stayed at the edge, her flashlight angled to provide light without flooding the space, her voice drifting down occasionally to remind Micah that he wasn't alone anymore. Reggie glanced around the underground chamber more fully now, and what he saw made his stomach twist, because this was no temporary hiding place, no accident of terrain, but a constructed space, the walls reinforced with boards that had once been part of a house or shed, the floor packed flat by years of small feet moving across it, and in one corner sat a low cot fashioned from planks and old blankets, worn thin and gray with age. "Micah," Reggie said gently, "do you sleep down here?" The boy nodded. "Sometimes," he whispered, "sometimes upstairs." Reggie's breath caught. "Upstairs?" Micah nodded again, pointing vaguely upward. "When he was here," the words settled heavily between them, because upstairs meant there was more than just this hole, that this place was part of something larger, something intentionally hidden, and Reggie felt a slow, controlled anger rise in his chest, the kind that demanded justice rather than revenge. "Is he here now?" Reggie asked softly. Micah shook his head quickly, fear flaring. "No," he said. "He said he wouldn't come back for a long time. He said I had to wait." Reggie placed a hand flat on the ground beside Micah, letting the boy see the gesture before moving any closer, and Micah's shoulders relaxed, just a fraction, enough to let Reggie know he was being trusted. "You don't have to wait anymore," Reggie said. "We're going to take you somewhere safe." Above them, Malik called down quietly, "Opening's good. Rope's ready." Reggie nodded and turned back to Micah. "We're going to lift you up," he explained. "It might feel strange, but we won't let you fall. I promise." Micah's eyes flicked upward toward the narrow shaft of daylight, doubt and hope wrestling across his face, and then he whispered, "Don't let go." Reggie felt something crack open in his chest at those words, and he reached out, taking Micah's small hand in his, firm but gentle. "I won't," he said. He guided Micah closer to him, carefully positioning the rope around the boy's torso, checking it twice, then calling up to the others to take the slack slowly. As Micah began to rise, his body stiffened, a small whimper escaping him, and Reggie spoke continuously, grounding him with words, describing what was happening, counting breaths, reminding him he was moving toward light, not away from it. The rope tightened, Malik and Big Leon lifting with controlled strength, and Micah's feet left the dirt floor for the first time in what felt like forever, his fingers clenching around Reggie's hand until the last moment, when Reggie had to release him so the others could pull him free. "I'll be right here," Reggie said as Micah was lifted out of sight, his voice following the boy upward like a thread tying them together. The moment Micah disappeared from view, Reggie stayed still, listening to the sounds above, the rustle of bodies shifting, the soft reassurances. Tasha murmured, and then the sound that made his throat tighten, Micah's. Sobs breaking free into open air, the sound of a child realizing he had survived. Reggie allowed himself one steady breath, then turned his attention back to the space around him. Because, now that Micah was out, the urgency shifted, and what remained was the truth this place was hiding. He stood slowly, scanning the walls more deliberately, and that was when he saw it. The other door Micah had mentioned, concealed behind a set of rotting boards that looked like part of the support structure until you noticed the hinges, rusted and half buried, their metal eaten away by time. Reggie's pulse quickened, not with fear but with grim certainty, and he reached out, pressing lightly against the boards, feeling the hollow space behind them respond. Above, Malik's voice called down, "He's out, he's safe." Reggie swallowed and replied, "Good, don't let him see this." He turned back to the hidden door, the air around it stale and cold, and for a moment he hesitated, because opening it meant stepping into a past that someone had gone to great lengths to erase. But the woods had already spoken, the child had already cried out, and whatever lay behind this door had forfeited its right to remain hidden. Reggie braced himself, pulled the boards aside with careful force, and as they fell away, revealing the door beneath, a rush of cold air spilled out, carrying with it the smell of decay and something else, something heavier, the scent of time trapped and rotting in the dark. And Reggie understood with a sickening clarity that this rescue had only just begun, because the secret buried in these woods was older and far more terrible than any of them had imagined, and once this door opened, there would be no closing it again. Reggie stood frozen for a moment before the hidden door, the weight of years pressing against his chest, as if the forest itself were leaning in to see whether he would have the courage to look. And when he finally pushed the door open fully, the sound it made was not a dramatic creak, but a low, reluctant groan, the sound of wood protesting after being left undisturbed for far too long. And the darkness beyond it felt different from the darkness of the chamber he stood in now. Heavier, colder, like air that had not been breathed in years. He swept his flashlight slowly across the space beyond, and what the beam revealed made his stomach drop, because this was no small crawl space or storage pit, but a narrow corridor carved into the earth, its walls lined with old boards and reinforced beams leading deeper underground like a wound that had never healed. The floor was uneven, packed dirt, worn smooth in places where feet had passed. Again and again, and scattered along the edges were objects that stopped Reggie in his tracks. A child's shoe hardened with age, a rusted metal cup, scraps of paper yellowed and brittle, each item whispering of time spent in silence. He took a careful step forward, the beam of light bouncing slightly with the tremor in his hand, and the smell grew stronger, damp and sour, layered with the unmistakable scent of something once alive that had been forgotten. And Reggie felt anger flare hot behind his ribs, not wild or reckless, but focused, sharpened by the understanding that this place had been designed to hide suffering. Above him, muffled by earth and wood, he could hear Malik's voice speaking softly to Micah, reassuring him, promising warmth and water and safety, and Reggie was grateful for the distance, because whatever lay here did not belong in a child's eyes. He moved deeper, counting his steps, noting how the corridor sloped slightly downward before leveling out, and after a few yards, it opened into a larger chamber, one that made his breath catch, because this space bore the marks of long-term habitation, not just by one person but by time itself. There was a low table built from rough planks, its surface scratched and worn, a lantern hanging from a hook on the wall, its glass cloudy with age, and along one side of the room were marks carved into the wood, shallow lines grouped in sets, tally marks etched carefully and methodically, stretching along the wall in rows that suggested someone had been counting days or weeks or something worse. Reggie's light lingered on those marks, and a sick understanding settled in, because there were too many of them to belong to a single year, too many to belong to one childhood, and his mind began to assemble a timeline he did not yet want to accept. He turned slowly, scanning the rest of the room, and his flashlight landed on a stack of newspapers bundled together with twine. The top page dated nearly 20 years earlier, the headline faded, but still readable enough to mention a missing child, a search that had gone cold, a case the world had eventually moved on from. Reggie's throat went dry, because this was no coincidence, no random hiding place, but a site connected deliberately to a crime that had been allowed to fade into obscurity, buried beneath time and trees and indifference. He crouched and picked up one of the papers, carefully, the pages crumbling slightly at his touch, and he scanned the grainy photograph printed near the top, a smiling black child whose eyes shone with the same shape of fear and resilience he had just seen in Micah, and though the face was older, the resemblance was undeniable enough to make Reggie's pulse thunder in his ears. He stood slowly, heart racing. Now, the pieces sliding together in a way that made the truth impossible to ignore, that this place had not just hidden one child, but had been part of something spanning decades, a cycle of confinement and silence that had begun long before Micah was born. The realization made the air feel thin, and Reggie forced himself to breathe, to keep his head clear, because panic would not serve anyone now, and he reached for his radio, clicking it on in a futile reflex before remembering there was no signal down here, that whatever justice was coming would have to Wait until they could bring the truth back into the open. He backed away slowly, not wanting to disturb anything further, because this place was evidence now, every object a witness that had been waiting far too long to be heard, and as he reached the doorway he paused, casting one last look over the chamber, the tally marks, the papers, the abandoned remnants of stolen years, and he felt a solemn vow take shape inside him, that this story would not be buried again. Reggie pulled the door closed gently, not to hide it, but to protect it until the world above could be made to listen. And as he climbed back toward the opening where light filtered down from the forest, he carried with him the certainty that the cry they had heard was not just Micah's, but the echo of a 20-year secret, finally demanding to be uncovered. By the time Reggie emerged back into the forest light, the world above felt unreal in contrast to what he had just seen: the green of the leaves too bright, the sky too open, and the sound of Micah's quiet breathing wrapped in Malik's hoodie, grounding him just enough to keep the truth from knocking the air out of his lungs. And as Reggie climbed fully out of the hidden opening, he met the eyes of the others, reading the same unspoken question in each of them. What did you find? And he answered without words at first, because sometimes the weight of knowledge shows itself before it is spoken. Tasha caught his look and understood immediately that whatever lay behind that door was not something that could be fixed with bandages and good intentions, and she shifted her stance instinctively, placing herself slightly between Micah and the opening, as if her body alone could block the darkness from reaching him again. Malik knelt beside Micah, holding a water bottle to the boy's lips, coaxing him gently to drink, while Big Leon wrapped an extra jacket around his shoulders, the boy's thin frame swallowed by warmth. And as Micah sipped, he looked around at the trees, at the faces, at the open sky, blinking slowly like someone waking from a long dream. "You did good," Malik murmured. "You did real good." Micah nodded faintly, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids, but when his gaze drifted toward the brush where the hole had been hidden, fear flickered again, and Reggie crouched in front of him, meeting his eyes. "That place is done," Reggie said firmly, his voice low and certain. "It can't hurt you anymore." Micah searched his face, as if testing the truth of the words, and then he whispered something that made Reggie's chest tighten. "He said nobody would believe me," Micah said. "He said people forget." Reggie shook his head slowly. "Not this time," he replied. "Not anymore." He straightened and turned to the others, his voice dropping into the calm, decisive tone that cut through panic and turned chaos into action. "We move now," he said. "We get him warm, we get to signal, and we don't leave this place unguarded." Tasha nodded immediately. "I'll take point back to the road," she said. "We're close enough to catch signal up there." Big Leon glanced back at the forest, jaw tight. "Someone stays," he said. "That door doesn't get closed again." Reggie agreed. "I'll stay," he said. "Malik, you take Micah with Tasha. Keep him talking, keep him present." Malik hesitated for a split second, clearly torn between wanting to stay and knowing Micah needed him, then nodded, lifting the boy carefully into his arms, mindful of the injured leg. As they moved away, Micah's head rested against Malik's shoulder, his eyes fluttering, and he murmured, half asleep, words that slipped out without warning. "She used to sing," Micah whispered. Malik paused. "Who used to sing?" he asked gently. Micah's brow furrowed, confusion mixing with memory. "The lady," he said, "before." The word hung there, heavy and incomplete, and Malik swallowed hard, understanding that Micah's story was layered, fractured by time and trauma, pieces waiting to be assembled. "What was her name?" Malik asked softly. Micah frowned again, trying to reach for something just beyond his grasp. "I don't know," he said. "He said names make trouble." Tasha cast a look back toward Reggie, eyes sharp, and Reggie nodded grimly, because names did make trouble, especially for people who wanted to erase the past. Malik continued toward the road, every step carrying Micah closer to help, closer to a world that would have to reckon with what had been hidden, while Reggie and Big Leon stayed behind, marking the area discreetly, noting landmarks, angles, distances, because they knew this place would soon swarm with lights and voices and questions, and they wanted the truth preserved, not trampled. As Reggie waited, listening to the forest settle again, he thought about the tally marks, the newspapers, the shoe, and the corridor carved by human intent, and he felt the timeline forming more clearly now, the understanding that this place had not been built for Micah alone, that Micah was the latest chapter in a story that stretched back 20 years, a story of a child taken, hidden, forgotten, and possibly replaced when time moved on and memory faded. The thought made his stomach churn, but it also hardened his resolve, because secrets depended on silence to survive, and silence had just been broken. When Tasha's voice crackled faintly through the radio a few minutes later, carrying the first weak signal bars they'd found, Reggie felt a grim relief settle in his chest. "We've got signal," she said. "Calling it in now." Reggie closed his eyes briefly, drawing a slow breath, because once authorities were involved, the story would move beyond their control, and he hoped fiercely that it would be handled with the care and seriousness it deserved. He looked once more at the hidden opening, at the forest that had guarded it for decades, and he understood now that the woods had not been protecting the secret out of malice, but out of indifference, the same indifference that allowed people to disappear when they were poor, or black, or forgotten. And as he waited for the sound of sirens to break through the trees, Reggie knew with absolute certainty that this rescue was not the end of the story, but the moment when a long-buried truth finally stepped into the light, ready to be faced by a world that had once looked away. The sirens reached the forest in fragments at first, faint and distant, weaving through the trees like something unreal. And when they finally grew loud enough to feel in the chest, Reggie knew there was no turning back, that the quiet protection the woods had offered for 20 years was giving way to voices, lights, and accountability. And as law enforcement and rescue crews pushed carefully through the brush toward the marked opening, he stood aside with Big Leon, hands visible, faces steady, ready to tell what they knew and what they feared, because this place demanded truth without embellishment. Paramedics reached Micah first, near the road, their movements calm and practiced, voices slow and reassuring as they examined his injured leg, wrapped him in thermal blankets, and lifted him gently onto a stretcher. And Malik stayed close, refusing to let the boy's hand go until a medic promised him that Micah wouldn't be alone. And even then, Malik walked alongside the gurney, talking softly, anchoring the child to the present with the sound of a human voice that meant safety. When detectives arrived, flashlights swept the trees, radios crackled, and the forest that had hidden the secret now reflected light in 1,000 small points, dew and leaves glittering like witnesses finally compelled to speak. And Reggie led them to the concealed opening, explaining how the brush had been arranged, how the boards had masked the door, how the space below bore the marks of long-term use. His voice controlled but heavy, because every word pulled the past closer to the surface. Officers descended carefully into the underground chamber, photographing, cataloging, preserving, and when they reached the hidden corridor beyond the second door, the mood shifted palpably. professionalism hardening into grim focus as the evidence confirmed what Reggie had already understood, that this was not an isolated incident, but the aftermath of a crime that had survived by being forgotten. News of a possible connection to a decades-old missing child spread quickly. Among the investigators, names whispered, dates cross-checked, cold case files mentally reopened, and when one detective emerged holding a sealed evidence bag containing the yellowed newspaper Reggie had seen, the air felt charged because paper did not lie the way. Memories could, and the past was about to collide with the present in ways no one could ignore. Outside the woods, squad cars lined the road, lights flashing silently, media vans gathering at a distance. One scanner picked up the call, and the quiet stretch of forest road transformed into a corridor of urgency and scrutiny. But through it all, Reggie's thoughts stayed with Micah, with the way the boy had flinched at certain words, with the fragments of memory that slipped out when he was tired, because Reggie knew the most important truth would not be found on a shelf or carved into wood, but in the careful, patient listening that would be required to help a traumatized child reclaim his story. Investigators asked Reggie and the others to recount everything in sequence, every sound, every decision, every detail. And they did, repeating the path they had taken the moment they heard the cry, the words Micah had spoken about the other door, about being told not to tell, about names making trouble, and with each retelling the weight of the pattern became clearer, a system of control designed to isolate, erase, and replace, and the idea chilled everyone who heard it. As dusk approached and the forest dimmed again, portable lights illuminated the area, casting harsh shadows that made the trees look skeletal, stripped of their quiet anonymity, and Reggie watched as forensic teams marked evidence, measured distances, and sealed the opening with care, not to hide it again, but to protect what it had finally given up. He felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, relief that the secret had been uncovered, sorrow that it had been allowed to exist at all. And when an officer approached him to say that Micah was being transported to a children's hospital and that child services and specialists were being called in, Reggie nodded, gratitude cutting through the anger, because at least now the boy's future would not be decided in darkness. The bikers regrouped near their motorcycles as night fell, engines silent, helmets off, faces drawn, the easy camaraderie of the morning replaced by something heavier, something forged by having stepped into a truth that would not let them go unchanged. And when Malik finally returned from the hospital run hours later, his eyes red but steady, he told them Micah was sleeping, safe for the moment, watched by people who knew how to help, and that knowledge settled over the group like a fragile peace. Yet even as they prepared to leave, none of them felt the usual relief of walking away from danger, because this was not danger they had escaped, but responsibility. They had inherited the responsibility to remember, to speak, to ensure that a 20-year silence did not claim another child. And as Reggie mounted his bike and looked once more toward the woods, now buzzing with activity and light, he understood that the cry they had answered was not only Micah's, but the echo of every voice that had been ignored before, and that answering it had bound them to a truth far larger than a single rescue, a truth that was only beginning to be revealed. In the days that followed, the forest no longer felt like a place of quiet escape, but like a scar the town could not stop touching, a reminder of something hidden too long. And as Micah lay in a Bama, hospital bed, wrapped in clean sheets and humming machines, the truth began to unravel thread by thread, pulled loose by careful hands that understood trauma did not release its grip all at once. Doctors treated his leg, documenting old injuries layered over newer ones, marks that told the story of repeated harm and neglect. And child psychologists sat with him in gentle sessions, letting silence do as much work as words, because Micah's memories did not come in straight lines. They came in fragments, in images and sounds and sensations that surfaced when he felt safe enough to let them rise. Malik visited when he was allowed, sitting quietly at the edge of the room, reading aloud from children's books he bought at the hospital gift shop, his deep voice steady and unhurried. And Micah listened, eyes half closed, absorbing the sound of someone staying without demanding anything in return. Each visit brought a little more trust, and with trust came pieces of the past, a woman who sang softly at night, a house that smelled like dust and old wood, a man whose voice changed when no one else was around, rules that made no sense but were enforced with fear, and a move into the woods that Micah remembered not as a beginning but as a continuation, as if he had always been meant to be hidden. Investigators worked alongside social workers, piecing together timelines from the objects found underground, matching dates on newspapers to missing persons reports. And the resemblance Reggie had noticed grew undeniable as forensic artists compared old photographs with Micah's features, adjusting age progression models, until the truth stared back at them from the screen. A child reported missing 20 years earlier, presumed dead by many, now possibly standing before them under a different name. The realization sent shockwaves through the department, reopening cold case files that had gathered dust, prompting calls to retired officers and forgotten witnesses. And as names resurfaced, so did uncomfortable questions about how a disappearance could fade without resolution, about which leads had been dismissed, which voices had gone unheard, and why. The bikers were asked to give formal statements again, their initial accounts now contextualized within a much larger investigation, and as they sat in interview rooms, recounting the same moments with new understanding, they felt the weight of having stepped into something that extended far beyond a single afternoon in the woods. Media attention intensified, headlines speaking of a miracle rescue and a buried secret, but Reggie bristled at the language, because miracles did not excuse negligence, and secrets buried for 20 years did not stay buried without help. He spoke carefully when approached by reporters, redirecting focus to Micah's recovery and the need for accountability rather than spectacle. And his measured words resonated with a public hungry for clarity and justice. As days turned into a week, Micah began to speak more freely, asking tentative questions about school, about whether the world outside the woods was always so loud, about whether people really lived in houses with windows that faced the road, and each question carried both innocence and grief, because they revealed what had been taken from him without his consent. Therapists guided him through grounding exercises, helping him name what he felt without reliving it fully, and slowly, the boy who had once whispered from a hole in the ground began to lift his voice in safer spaces, reclaiming language that had been used to control him. Meanwhile, forensic teams returned to the site repeatedly, expanding their search radius, uncovering remnants of structures long since collapsed, evidence that suggested the underground chamber had once been connected to a house that burned down years earlier under suspicious circumstances, its ruins dismissed as an accident, its aftermath never fully examined. The implication tightened around the investigation like a noose, because if the house had been the original site of confinement, then the move underground was not a retreat, but a continuation, a way to preserve secrecy when exposure threatened. Community members watched the developments with a mixture of horror and guilt, realizing that the woods they drove past without a thought had hidden suffering in plain sight, and town halls filled with tense conversations about vigilance, about listening, about how easily silence could become complicity. Through it all, the bikers remained connected, checking in on Micah through approved channels, coordinating with advocates to ensure he would not disappear into bureaucracy now that he had finally been found, and their presence, quiet and consistent, became a stabilizing force rather than a spectacle. Reggie often thought back to the moment they first heard the cry, to how close they had come to dismissing it as an animal or a trick of the wind, and he understood now that the most dangerous thing about secrets was not the effort it took to hide them, but the ease with which the world learned to ignore faint, inconvenient sounds. And as Micah's story continued to unfold, he knew that the true test would not be whether the past was exposed, but whether the lessons learned would be loud enough to prevent another voice from ever having to cry alone in the woods again. The town could not pretend anymore, not after the story broke wide open and forced its way into kitchens, classrooms, and quiet conversations that had once skirted around uncomfortable truths. And as the investigation deepened, Maple Ridge began confronting not just a crime, but its own reflection, a realization that something terrible had existed within reach of everyday life while people passed by, trusting that silence meant safety. Community meetings filled the old high school gym, folding chairs, scraping against polished floors, as residents gathered with anxious faces, voices low and urgent, and officials stood at the front answering questions that had no easy responses. Because how do you explain 20 years of absence without admitting failure? Parents held their children closer that week, eyes lingering on the tree lines that bordered playgrounds and back roads, and teachers noticed how often students asked about Micah, about whether he would be okay, about how someone could disappear and still be alive. And those questions carried more weight than any headline because they demanded honesty rather than reassurance. Past cases were pulled from dusty archives, files reopened and re-examined, and names that had once been footnotes became focal points. Former residents questioned, land ownership histories traced, old rumors revisited with fresh urgency. And through it all, the sense grew that this was not just one man's crime, but a collective blind spot, formed by assumptions, by biases, by the quiet habit of looking away when something felt too complicated to face. Faith leaders spoke from pulpits about vigilance and compassion, urging congregations to listen harder, to believe children, to recognize that harm often hides behind normalcy. And those sermons landed differently now, stripped of abstraction by the knowledge that a child had been hidden within walking distance of their prayers. The bikers were invited to speak at one of the town halls, not as heroes, but as witnesses. And when Reggie stood before the crowd, helmet in his hands, he did not raise his voice or dramatize the rescue. He simply described hearing a cry and choosing not to ignore it, and that simplicity unsettled people more than any accusation could have, because it left them with a question they had to answer for themselves. What would I have done? Media trucks parked outside the gym, cameras trained on, faces etched with discomfort and resolve. And though some bristled at the attention, others understood that visibility was part of accountability, that sunlight was necessary even when it burned. As the days passed, law enforcement confirmed what many had feared, that Micah's situation was connected to a missing child reported 2 decades earlier, a case quietly closed. After years of fruitless searching, and the confirmation rippled through the community like a shockwave, forcing long-buried grief back to the surface. People who had once known the child, neighbors, teachers, distant relatives, came forward with memories and regrets, wondering aloud how signs had been missed, how warnings had gone unheeded, and those conversations, painful as they were, began stitching together a collective understanding that vigilance could not be optional or selective. The bikers remained present but unobtrusive, attending meetings, offering support, listening more than they spoke, and their presence reminded the town that responsibility did not belong to institutions alone, but to individuals willing to act when something felt wrong. As Maple Ridge grappled with its past, there was anger, yes, but also a determination taking root, a promise whispered in hallways and spoken aloud at meetings, that silence would not be allowed to settle so comfortably again, that cries, no matter how faint or inconvenient, would be answered. And as the town stood at the uneasy intersection of reckoning and resolve, it became clear that Micah's rescue had not just uncovered a secret, it had cracked open a long-ignored truth, that communities are defined not by the absence of evil, but by how quickly and courageously they respond when it is finally exposed. Healing did not arrive in a straight line for Micah, or for the people who now carried his story with them, but it began the way real healing often does, quietly and imperfectly, built from patience. Rather than promises, and as the weeks turned into months, the boy who had once whispered from beneath the earth started learning what it meant to exist in the open without fear, surrounded by professionals trained to help him reclaim a childhood that had been interrupted and reshaped by secrecy. Therapists worked with him daily, not forcing memories into the light, but teaching him how to ground himself in the present, how to name sensations, emotions, and boundaries, giving him tools that replaced the rules of silence he had been taught with a language of choice and safety. There were setbacks, nights when sleep refused to come, and the smell of damp soil seemed to rise unbidden in his mind, moments when sudden noises made him flinch or freeze. But there were also breakthroughs, small victories that mattered more than any headline, like the first time he laughed without looking around to see if it was allowed, or the first time he asked for something simply because he wanted it. Malik and the others stayed involved in ways that respected the structures put in place for Micah's protection, sending books and drawings, recording short voice messages when visits were limited, reminders that the people who had heard his cry had not disappeared once the spotlight moved on. And that consistency became one of the most powerful forms of reassurance, proof that care could endure beyond crisis. Social workers carefully evaluated placement options, prioritizing stability and long-term support over speed. And when a foster family was chosen, it was with intention, people who understood trauma, not as something to fix quickly, but as something to live alongside with empathy, and Micah met them slowly, at his own pace, testing trust the way someone who had been hurt learns to do, cautiously and with eyes wide open. At the same time, the legal process moved forward with a different rhythm, deliberate and exacting, as investigators continued to trace land records, financial transactions, and personal histories connected to the hidden structure in the woods, building a case that could withstand scrutiny. Because accountability demanded more than outrage, it demanded proof. As the identity of the perpetrator came into focus, the community grappled with the unsettling realization that the person responsible had once been seen as ordinary, unremarkable, someone who blended into the background of daily life. And that understanding forced people to confront how easily danger could wear the mask of normalcy. Reggie followed these developments closely, not out of obsession, but out of a sense of responsibility, attending court dates when allowed, checking in with advocates, ensuring that Micah's voice was not lost amid legal language and procedure. And he often reflected on how different the outcome might have been if the bikers had dismissed that first cry as something inconvenient or unlikely. The woods, once a place of escape for them, became a symbol of both harm and resilience, a reminder that darkness could be challenged by attention and action. And as trails were cleared and signs posted, the physical landscape changed alongside the emotional one, marked now by awareness rather than ignorance. Micah began attending school in a small, supportive setting where teachers were briefed and compassionate, and each day he spent learning letters and numbers, drawing pictures of open fields and houses with windows, added another layer to a future that had once seemed impossible. He spoke more often now, asking questions about the world beyond the hospital. Walls, about seasons and holidays and simple routines, and those questions carried a quiet joy because they signaled curiosity rather than fear. For the bikers, healing meant acknowledging their own reactions too, the anger that lingered, the images that surfaced uninvited, the realization that witnessing trauma left marks even on those who intervened, and they leaned on one another, talking openly about what they felt, modeling the same honesty they hoped the world would offer Micah. As the case progressed and the truth continued to surface, it became clear that the most meaningful justice would not be found in a single verdict, but in the systems changed, the vigilance renewed, and the commitment made to listen when something felt wrong. And while scars remained, visible and invisible, there was also growth, a fragile but persistent hope taking root. Because from the place where a child had once been hidden, a path forward was being built, step by careful step, toward a life defined not by what had been done to him, but by what he was finally free to become. The woods grew quiet again as winter edged toward spring, but it was not the same silence that had once swallowed Micah's voice, because now the quiet carried memory, responsibility, and resolve. And Reggie often thought about how close that truth had come to remaining buried forever beneath leaves and neglect. He rode past that stretch of forest weeks later, engines humming low, the trees standing tall and indifferent as they always had, and he understood then that places do not choose what they hide, people do, and that listening is an act of courage long before it becomes an act of rescue. Micah's life continued forward in small, meaningful steps, a calendar filling with school days and therapy sessions, friendships forming slowly, laughter returning in cautious bursts. And though the past would always be part of him, it no longer defined the edges of his world, because people had chosen to stay, to listen, and to protect. Without asking him to be anything other than a child learning how to live in daylight, the investigation concluded not with the satisfaction of easy answers, but with the harder truth that systems fail when voices are ignored, and that justice, when it comes, arrives late and incomplete unless communities commit to vigilance beyond headlines and courtrooms. Maple Ridge carried that lesson forward, schools revising reporting procedures, neighbors paying closer attention, parents teaching children that silence was never a rule they had to follow. And though the town would always bear the mark of what had been uncovered, it also bore the mark of what had been changed. The bikers returned to their roads, but they rode differently now, ears tuned not just to engines and wind, but to the spaces between sounds, the places where a voice might be waiting to be heard. And they spoke openly about what had happened, not as a legend of bravery, but as a reminder that action begins with believing what you hear. Reggie remembered Micah's words most of all, the fear wrapped around, "Don't leave me." And he understood that the greatest failure of the past had not been cruelty alone, but abandonment, the collective decision to look away when the truth felt too uncomfortable to confront. As seasons turned and the forest shifted through color and light, the hidden chamber was sealed. Permanently, not erased, but marked. A physical acknowledgement that something had happened there and that it would not be forgotten again. Micah visited the edge of the woods once, accompanied and supported, standing at a safe distance, breathing steadily. And when he turned away, he did so without fear, choosing the open road over the darkness that had once claimed him. The story did not end with closure, because real stories rarely do, but with a charge, a quiet demand placed on everyone who heard it, to listen more closely, to trust instincts that say something is wrong, and to understand that the smallest cry, when answered, can unravel decades of silence. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause or listen differently, then carry that forward, because somewhere a voice may still be waiting beneath indifference, and when it calls out, the choice to hear it belongs to all of us. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you believe that listening can change lives, then like, subscribe, and stay with this channel, because there are truths still hidden, voices still unheard, and every act of attention has the power to bring what was buried back into the light.